Hi, and welcome to this session, 30 Things That You Should Never Do with System Center Configuration Manager. My name's Orin Thomas. You can follow me on Twitter at Orin Thomas, or you can visit my website, which is a bit out of date and just basically has a list of books I've written, at orinthomas.com. Okay, so to frame this session a little bit for you, this is more of a fun session, and it's just some general advice about Configuration Manager based on stuff that I've seen and friends of mine who are Microsoft consultants have seen people do that's a really bad idea. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get a lot out of it. Okay, to start with, many people work in an environment where Configuration Manager was deployed and configured by someone else. So, to an extent, this is your absolution slide. If you find in this talk that you recognize some of the bad habits that I'm talking about, you can always sort of turn around and say to yourself, well, you know what? Someone else actually was responsible for setting this up. It's not my fault. So, however you live with yourself. But what it really means is you can blame the person that set it up if you recognize some of the questionable practices detailed in this talk. The reality is that most people come into an existing environment where Configuration Manager is deployed. Most people aren't working in a greenfields deployment of Configuration Manager. In some cases, it's been upgraded multiple times. There's a lot of people I know who are running a Configuration Manager version that's current that was at one stage sort of an SMS distribution as well. So the other thing about this talk is it'll give you a checklist of bad habits to look for when you inherit a Configuration Manager deployment. Because Configuration Manager, as much as Microsoft likes to talk about everything being cloud-based and everything going to the cloud, the reality is that Configuration Manager is going to be around for many decades to come. Organizational change, especially in IT, is actually a lot slower than Microsoft would like. And so even though they sort of don't talk about Config Manager as much as they used to, one of the realities is that one of the most popular course taught in Microsoft official curriculum is actually the Configuration Manager courses, just because there's so many organizations that are out there that actually need it. Anyway, so you are, especially if you move jobs and you've got that skill set, you're going to probably, over the course of your working life, work with a couple of different Configuration Manager deployments. Okay, so at the beginning, let's admit a truth. Configuration Manager is an extraordinarily complicated product. It's got so many aspects to it that even when you're teaching it in a week-long course, you are really only ever brushing over at a very high level the stuff it does. Like, for example, when you're teaching the course, you spend maybe a day on operating system deployment. You could spend more than a week on operating system deployment and still have a lot to cover. And it's not just everything it does. It does software deployment, it does inventory, it does configuration management, it does endpoint protection, it does all of those amazing things. So let's start. This is one of the most complicated products that Microsoft makes, and understanding it is challenging. And that's why we end up with a lot of bad habits, because people go, well, I'm in a rush. I need to do this as quickly as possible. This looks like a reasonable way to do it. And while it might be a reasonable way to do it, it's probably not the best way that you should actually do something. The other thing that's important to remember is that Configuration Manager is an unforgiving product. We've all heard the stories. There was a case in Australia not more than a few years ago where the largest bank in the country had all of its desktop computers erased by a task sequence that was initiated by a contractor from one of the big IT companies, and the head of that company had to fly out from California to the Sydney office of the head of that bank and personally apologise for completely stuffing up their system. But where I'm going with this is that with Config Manager, you can cause an awful lot of damage if you don't know what you're doing or if you're not very careful with what you're doing. So one of the big problems that I see when it comes to the way that IT people tend to solve problems, when they run into a problem and they can't find an explicit answer in the documentation, is that they go to Google and they try and solve problems with Configuration Manager by just Googling things. Now, that's okay if you have developed a good sense of skepticism, and you have a good nose for whether or not something's worked. But the reality is, if you look at a lot of forum posts, you'll hear person describes their problem, and then you'll get maybe an answer or maybe not. But you never necessarily hear back and hear, well, you know what, that actually solved it for me. What you've really got to think about whenever you're using a forum or a post in a forum to solve a problem is the problem being described very much the same problem that you have, or does it just sound similar? Because you may be trying to apply a solution to a problem that you don't have. Also, is there any evidence that this has actually solved things? Querying Google for a solution to a problem and trying to decide which of a multitude of offered solutions is most likely to solve the problem without hosing your deployment is what I call configuration manager roulette. And we know that a lot of people do this, okay? This is a very bad habit. It's certainly something that you shouldn't do. You should always, as the old saying says, measure twice, cut once. Don't go, that looks good, I'll try that. And as I say often to people, if you're desperate enough to post about a problem in a forum, you're often desperate enough to try the first reasonable sounding answer in your production environment. And that way leads to tears, and sometimes it even leads to going to find a new job. Especially when you're starting off. You see people that are starting off with Config Manager and they've just been handed Config Manager and they haven't done anything with it. Always be really insanely careful when you're learning Config Manager, because the training wheels on this one shouldn't come off too soon. Okay, let's get a bit more explicit with the problems that we're going to discuss. Let's talk about problems around the use of accounts. Everybody that uses the Configuration Manager console does not need to be a full administrator. Okay, this is what you see in a lot of organizations. You've got anybody who's working with Config Manager, rather than being particularly granular with it, they're just added to full administrator and they can do anything. So the principle of role-based access control is always an excellent one. You should always implement it, and you should always use it, and you should always give people the least amount of permissions that they actually need to do things. In fact, you should set up separate administrator or administrative accounts for each role that people need to perform. So instead of everybody having full administrator permissions associated with their domain account, there should be a very specific account that's used for that particular task. And you might give even a solution like Enterprise Random Password Manager where people check out that account to use that account. Or you could use something like just-in-time administration. There's ways that you can do this so that these accounts aren't used just willy-nilly. So in this slide, we can see we've got role-based administration. Now, you can apply permissions to specific scopes if you want. And that, I would say, is more advanced config manager security. If you're in a really big organization, that makes sense. But what I tend to see is that everybody's just a member of full administrator and role-based administration isn't used at all. The reality is no one needs to be a full administrator. Your daily driver account should maybe be in the operations administrator role, and that allows you to do basically everything except for to go and mess with security settings. The security administrator exists to modify security settings, and you should only really need to use that in the event that you need to go and modify security settings. So you have a separate account for each role. Your daily driver is operations administrator. Occasionally you'll need to log on with a security administrator account, but don't go and sort of Swiss Army knife all of these roles onto one account. Keep the roles for separate accounts, simply because Config Manager is, in a way, it's the best botnet server, because if you've got control of Config Manager, you've got control of basically every computer in the organization. So people go after it, and you want to limit what an attacker can do if they've compromised your account. As they say in the Microsoft security courses, it's much easier to compromise an admin than it is to compromise the system that an admin manages. Basically, what you do is you work out what role a particular person needs for a particular task, and you get them to use that particular account to perform that. Don't go and just full administrator that. And just as I said, don't make everybody an operations administrator unless that's actually their job. If someone's only responsible for performing operating systems deployment, make them an operating systems deployment manager role. Give them that role. Don't go and make them an operations administrator where they've got a whole lot of permissions that they don't actually need. Now, this shouldn't need to be reiterated, but don't allow anyone who's new to managing Config Manager anywhere near production task sequences. The amount of trouble that you can get in with a task sequence is phenomenal. Now, obviously, you can't do anything about that if you work at an organization, the person who is the config manager administrator quits and you're given their role without any training. Make sure that you get training and make sure you have a virtualized environment, a virtual lab with config manager where you can play around with stuff. Basically, the best config manager administrators have a fair amount of scar tissue. And the more scar tissue you've got, the less likely you are to do something stupid. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is network accounts. The network access account, the client push account, and the network domain join account don't need to be members of the domain admins group. You see this fairly often. It's like, oh, I can't work out what permissions to go and give those accounts. I know what I'll do. I'll add them to the domain's admins group. Okay? Most of these accounts need very basic permissions. For example, a network access account only needs network access to pull files. Lock down the network access account also, simply because the password and user hash can be extracted from any device that's got the config manager client installed. And if you can pull that, and imagine if it's a member of the domain admins group and there's been attacks where this has been done, then the person who's attacking you has domain dominance. You should use separate accounts for client push, network access, and network domain join. This is because each account requires separate and basically a unique set of permissions. By providing a different account for each of these config manager accounts, it helps you do forensic auditing when something goes wrong, but also remember the principle of least privilege. For example, the network access account, the client push account, should not have the ability to join computers to the domain. And none of these accounts need the log on locally right. So again, when you are configuring the accounts that these are going to be used for, make sure you follow the principle of least privilege. Because what you see, especially if you go in or you inherit a config manager environment, this is one of the first things you go and check. Because the lazy administrator who set it up before you is using one account to do this, has put it into the domain admins groups, and has not locked down these accounts. And as I said, some of these accounts, all you need to do is compromise an endpoint, and then you've got access to the network access account credentials. If that's a member of the domain admins group, it's game over for your network. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is primary, secondary, and CAS. Now, here is a good rule of thumb. If you're not sure whether or not you need a central administration site, the reality is that you don't need a central administration site. Also remember with Config Manager, you do have the ability to add one later. Now, why do I say you probably don't need a central administration site? Well, a primary site can actually handle about 150,000 clients. Now, I'm sure that some of you actually have more than that, but in reality, the number of organizations that have more than 150,000 configuration manager clients are only a small subset of the total number of configuration manager deployments. So for pretty much most clients in, for example, Australia and New Zealand, a single primary site is fine. In fact, the main reason why people put in a central administration site and have multiple primary sites is because there's political or regulatory reasons for them to have to do it. For example, they might have a location in Australia and a location in New Zealand, and regulation might say that New Zealanders can't manage Australian stuff and Australians can't manage New Zealand. Other thing to think about, do your boundaries make sense? Or are clients, for example, in Wellington, hitting a deployment point, a DP, in Hobart when installing packages? Okay, so for those of you who aren't up in your Australian, New Zealand geography, that would be like our clients in Los Angeles going out to Vancouver or Toronto to actually install packages. Now, the boundaries for Configuration Manager are generated from Active Directory sites and services. Now, the reality about Active Directory sites and services is a lot of organizations don't actually get around to updating their Active Directory sites. simply because Active Directory will generally function okay if you don't do this. It won't function really well, and you should go and define your subnets and have a site be, good local area network connection. But there's enough organizations that never bother to do this that this is worth sort of pointing out to you. So go in and check Active Directory to see if your sites are sane, or if you don't have permissions to do that, if Active Directory is handled by someone else, go and ask them about how sites are configured, because that is how Config Manager determines its network topology. Clients within a boundary are assumed to have fast connections to one another, and they will default to using SMB rather than protocols that are a bit more latency tolerant like bits and HTTPS when they're performing a cross-boundary pull. And I can give you many, many examples. One of my favorite is I had a client that I was teaching where they had Config Manager in the state of Queensland. Now, Queensland's a very, very, very big state. If you think states like Texas are very big, you've got to go and look at states like Western Australia and Queensland. So the way that this organisation was set up is that they had a lot of offices in rural cities in Queensland. So one site was out at a town called Roma, which is about 1,000 kilometres to the west of Brisbane. And another site was in a place called Cairns, which is up on the Great Barrier Reef and about 1,000 kilometres north of Brisbane. Now, Cairns' connection to Roma went through Brisbane, so 2,000 kilometre round trip. More than 1,000 miles for those of you who aren't too good with kilometres. Now, unfortunately, Cairns and Roma were located within the same Active Directory site. So when people were trying to install software in Roma, they were pulling it off the DP that was sitting in Cairns, which was quite some way away. So do a sensibility check. Let's talk about collections a bit more. If stuff not turning up in the console, you may need to go and look at your discovery settings. Okay, so it's common to see, for example, AD user discovery turned on, but not things like group discovery. So you can't use groups when you're configuring things for Config Manager, simply because they're not being discovered. You really do need to understand how discovery methods work and what they do and how often you want to run them and what you're expecting to see in the console after discovery runs. Now, the other thing is to have sane discovery. You don't need to do user discovery every 5 minutes. Think about it, right? How often are users added to your environment? Well, you need something for your discovery settings that will pick up new users when they're added within a reasonable amount of time, but you don't really need to do this every 5 minutes because you're probably not going to have that sort of staff turnover. You also probably don't need to run a full discovery every time. Sometimes it's fine to run a delta, especially on things like users who probably don't change as often as you'd think. Okay, so let's talk a bit more specifically about collections. Collections don't need to be fully updated every 15 minutes. Now, the reason why this is important is that the collection evaluator is single-threaded and it works on one collection at a time. So if you've got a lot of collections being updated and you've got them updating too frequently, the collections will never actually properly be updated, because what will happen is a full update won't occur of the collection before it tries to basically restart the process. One common rule of thumb that I've heard from a couple of Config Manager consultants is that you should give a collection about 4 hours to update in a moderate-sized organisation. So keep that in mind. A colleague of mine had a customer that had 400 collections that were configured to update every 10 minutes, and that's why their collections weren't being populated. It was just never even getting through them the first time. So 4 hours may sound like a lot, but again, how often are your collections changing? That's what you've really got to think about. If you're, say, doing all of the computers that are sitting in Melbourne, how often are you seeing a change in the computers that are sitting out in Melbourne? Now, don't use all systems as a default limiting collection, simply because it makes every query crawl. So don't do everybody that lives in Melbourne out of everybody on planet Earth, at least everyone that lives in Melbourne out of everybody that lives in Australia, or everybody that lives in Melbourne out of everybody that lives in the state of Victoria. What you want to do is you want to have your limiting collection be as close as possible to the collection that you're trying to create. And that might mean that you've got collections that you don't actually use stuff for, but allow you to have that sanity check when it comes to your queries. Because what can happen with query performance is if query performance is bad, your collections aren't going to be there. So do spend some time on this. In fact, do performance sanity checks on query-based collections. There's tools out there that allows you to evaluate the speed of collection. Remember that the evaluator only works on one collection at a time, but also remember that WQL, which is used by Config Manager, isn't SQL. It means it can have weird lockups, and even seemingly sane queries can cause performance issues. If you've inherited a Config Manager deployment, this should be one of the things that you check, because what you will find is maybe the person that was there before you didn't do a sanity check and they've got some really weird query code going that's really slowing down how things work. Let's talk about inventory and metering. Don't enable hardware inventory on all classes, because then it's checking for everything that it knows about. Only really look for hardware that you need to find, and don't have it evaluate the entire catalog of hardware each time. Lots of stuff that Config Manager looks for hasn't been around for a long time. So what you want to do is you want to really limit what your hardware inventory is, and do it. If you're only needing hardware inventory, think about why you need that information. If you're creating collections based on specific hardware, great. Look for that hardware, but you don't need to know about everything and look for everything. Go through the whole dictionary to find 5 words sort of a thing. Also, don't run hardware inventory every 15 minutes. Again, ask yourself that sanity check question. How often does the hardware in your organization change? The reality is it probably doesn't change all that often. So if you've got a fleet of laptop computers that you're managing with Config Manager, or you've got a fleet of desktop computers that have got essentially the same configuration, you probably don't need to be running hardware inventory all that often. Work out what's sane and do it that way. Don't bog Config Manager down in constantly running queries, because again, that's why it won't perform as well as you are hoping. If you're enabling software inventory, remember to configure scanning. You've actually got to tell software inventory what to look like. You don't just turn it on. Also, don't scan for software inventory every 15 minutes. Again, have your sanity check. How often is software in your organization, software configuration changing? That would be a reasonable guess as to how often you should be performing that sort of query. The other thing, don't meter everything. Software metering is where you track how often an application is used. So meter stuff that you need to know about. You probably don't need to meter how often Word is used, but you would probably want to meter how often stuff like Photoshop or Project or Visio are used, simply because with Word, that's probably on everybody's computer anyway. But one of the advantages of software metering is it can make sure that you're being rational with the number of licenses that you're purchasing, and that people that are licensed for a product are absolutely using that product. And if they're not using that product, maybe they don't need a license for it. Okay, let's talk about fun with clients. Remember to update the Configuration Manager client when a new version comes out. A lot of errors occur because an older Config Manager client is reporting to a newer Config Manager infrastructure. So remember to update that client whenever you update your Config Manager. Don't call a WMI repair script as a startup script for client computers. There are so many reasons why this is a bad idea. And the reason that people actually do this is that they go onto forums, and when they see a particular error being talked about, a particular problem with a client, one of the things that you'll often see as a suggestion is go and do a WMI rebuild. So some people come to the conclusion, well, maybe I should just do that all the time. Literally, you are better off redeploying the client than doing a WMI rebuild. It's a tool of last resort, and yeah, you may need to use it, but do so really, really sparingly, and have that in mind. It's not the first tool that you should pull out of your toolkit when you've got a problem with a client computer. Basically, what happens when you do this is it makes Config Manager think it's dealing with a new machine. So it performs all those new machine tasks. And you can imagine, and there are people who basically run this as a scheduled tasks, that can really cause some problems with Config Manager. Now, here's a really big one, and it's got one of my favorite forum quotes about Config Manager associated with it. Basically, someone was running a WMI repair task on a site server as a scheduled task. And this was a response by someone who knows a lot about Config Manager. Did you actually do this? God, I hope your resume is up to date. As to what kind of issues? Well, it breaks everything, and nothing will ever work again. Ever. Okay? You are better basically redeploying your site server than going off and doing this. Make sure you follow up on endpoint protection reports. That is, if you're getting information about someone having a virus, maybe give them a call if you see that a couple of times and find out what behavior they're engaging in that's making System Center Endpoint Protection actually flag their system. Follow up on problematic client computers. If there's a client that's a problem, go and remediate that client. Sometimes wipe and load is the simplest solution. And if you've got your config manager deployment humming, wipe and load should be a quick process. User data should be actually stored in other locations so that you can swap in a new system or you can swap in a wipe and load as a way of solving that problem. It's much better than spending an inordinate amount of time trying to manually diagnose why a specific client is having an issue. Sometimes just pave it and get on with it. In terms of managing Configuration Manager, well, make sure you install software updates for Configuration Manager and the underlying host OS. Don't avoid doing that. Don't be pushing out updates from Config Manager to everything else and then forgetting to update Config Manager itself. Make sure that you are looking regularly at your status logs and alerts and understanding what's in there. It's never going to be pristine, but make sure that you're dealing with stuff that actually comes up there. Also, go in and regularly have a look at how your maintenance tasks are going. Check that they're functioning properly. There's one of those things that people sometimes leave and they're only ever looking at this stuff when they've got a problem. As part of your general routine, you should be checking in on this stuff on a regular basis, not just when things have absolutely gone pear-shaped and you're terrified that things are never going to work again. Something else to consider is when was the last time you did a backup or disaster recovery drill of your config manager infrastructure? If your servers running config manager fell over tomorrow, are you going to be able to recover them if they suffer, hard disk failure, or if everything goes wrong, or if they get a CryptLocker infection? Are you able to rebuild everything? Very important to know the process. And the good thing about doing drills is that if you've drilled enough, when the actual bad thing happens, then you can basically work on autopilot and get things working again. In terms of your databases, don't forget about SQL Server. Now, unless you're running tens of thousands of clients, generally it's fine to co-locate SQL with Config Manager. SQL Express is generally fine for secondaries, and remember to configure the maximum memory for SQL Server or it will eat all the RAM. So say, okay, we've got this much RAM on the box, we're going to give you this much SQL, because if we let you do whatever you want, you're just going to take all of the RAM. It's sort of like Google Chrome. Also, this is an important one. Don't ever go and manually edit the site database, even if you're a SQL guru and think that you are knowing what you are doing. The way that this database is configured is like a Gordian knot. There's weird stuff going on in there that the config manager team has put in for good reasons. It's sort of like the Millennium Falcon, right? You don't want to pull the wrong knob because you think that you know what you're doing, because suddenly the hyperdrive fails and you're stuck going to Cloud City, and we saw how that worked out for Han Solo. In terms of operating system deployment, well, first of all, you should certainly not be deploying Windows 7 RTM images in 2018. Make sure that you're keeping your images in a regularly up-to-date state so that post-deployment, there's a minimal amount of stuff that's going on. If you can get that to all happen so that the most up-to-date image is being deployed as possible, that's a good way to be, because that's going to make deployment a lot easier for you. You also don't need a new operating system deployment task sequence for every hardware build. Go and investigate task sequence variables. Never, ever, 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 ever push an operating system image to all systems. Okay, this has happened in multiple organizations that you've heard about, and they've wiped everything. I can think of at least one Australian bank where I mentioned earlier in the talk that it's happened, but I've heard of it happening at schools. I've heard of it happening at hospitals. Okay. Always push an operating system image to the smallest collection possible. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed this session. And if you want to get in contact with me, it's @Orin Thomas on Twitter, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got. Thank you very much.